The moral universal is known by a lot of names, some of which are the universal moral dictum, the categorical imperative, the first-order principle. But they all assume the same thing, that there is a single statement of truth that, if followed, defines the difference between good and evil. Understanding good and evil suggests such a moral dictum or principle ought to exist, but no one has discovered it up until now. Suggestions have been made, but there is no agreement on what a moral absolute would look like. But those who sought the ultimate truth statement did not really understand what they were looking for. John Stuart Mill offered the suggestion that people did ought to be of use, that whatever we did ought to make the majority of persons happy or benefit them in some way. But the problem always comes down to who plays the role of God, who ultimately decides if the moral dictum is being applied or not. Kant figured there had to be a law that was higher than all other laws, and if what we did reflected this law, then the supplemental law would be a valid guide of behavior. But the law cannot exist that validates all good actions, nor which condemns all bad behavior. Man had it pretty good in Eden, but it appears even in Eden he lacked a true moral dictum. This does not mean first principles did not exist in Eden. Man did not abide by the first principle and was summarily ejected. But without understanding first principles, we cannot understand what we did that was wrong in God's eyes, nor will we learn to do what is right. Two persons arguing over the distance to Glasgow can argue interminably or measure the distance in miles or kilometers. Then the argument ends. The unit of measure is a moral ideal. The inch is perfected in its reliability and precision. All distances are equal to the number of inches or miles or kilometers that separate the 2 points. This reflects a moral good or moral ideal because it is something which we can have faith in. Morality produces faith. It is possible to have faith only in what is morally good. It seems obvious that something ought to divide good from evil. Yet, when we talk about good and evil or God and Satan, we talk as if the two are at opposite ends of a long spectrum, indeed, an infinitely long spectrum. This suggests that good and evil are unreachable ideals, infinitely distant regardless of where one is on the spectrum. Such a conception of good and evil is morally unsatisfactory and conceptually impossible to fathom. This is why it requires ethical rules to function and provides no moral satisfaction or faith. The best one can do to picture such a situation is to depict a two-headed arrow, meaning one can set off in the direction of good, or turn around and set off in the direction of evil. But one will never reach either destination. This way of thinking about good and evil is not logical or easy to comprehend, but worse, it eliminates the very thing it was meant to illustrate. Good and evil are moral concepts, not ethical. They cannot be described in law nor established by a set of rules. If good and evil are at the opposite ends of an infinitely long spectrum, and all humans occupy the middle area, then there are only beings with traits we call good and bad, but these are just human traits. Meaning we have extrapolated from what exists to what might theoretically exist, but which has no phenomenological correlate. But if good and evil do not exist, then everything is permissible. Kant argued that the categorical imperative was the inception of a universal law. If what we did was not able to be conceived of as a universal law, it was better left alone. But criminals do not think in terms of universal laws. They think in terms of what ought to be permitted to them because of the extenuating circumstances of their life. They are, in their eyes, getting even with the world. And so in their reality, there is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and the world must pay for the harm done them. It's not that Kant's idea lacks value, but that it assumes reason and rational judgment where none is present. Humans cannot be permitted to judge the validity of their actions at the personal level. Too few are able to see the beam in their eye. It is a disaster when we put someone in charge of looking for faults in others. What is good and evil if it is part of the province of man? Surely it would need to be in judgment of man, not man the judge of what is good and evil. This has been the rock upon which all previous efforts to define good and evil have crashed. Good and evil must be objectively defined and measured and therefore determined by a quantifiable index. It cannot be left up to the individual to decide if something ought to be a universal law or how pragmatic it is. In quantification, a stream of values is either in the negative or positive class of things. This means that good and evil ought to be divided by an invisible line, the good on one side and the evil on the other side of the line, just as there are profits and losses and a business is on one side or the other of this line. on their balance sheet. This truth gives us an insight to the moral universal and an absolute categorical imperative. This relevance is made even more apparent if we imagine the classical free market, where businesses have no regulatory framework to work within but must rely solely on the mechanisms of the free market. The crucial element of a free market is that no one is obliged to pay a cost that they did not originate. That is, in a true free market, there are no externalized costs. Adam Smith talked about the butcher who did not give fair weights losing business. But the butcher who emptied his wastewater into a local water supply would in effect be selling people who did not wish to be his customers a product they did not wish to purchase. That is, the wastewater from the business. Like the case of Dracula, a seller of something no one wishes to purchase is likely to find himself put out of business in a more violent way than suggested simply by the failure of customers to patronize one's place of business. The dictum would then be, do not create costs you yourself cannot pay, or pay your own way and cause no cost to be left for others to cover. Imagine a community that lived by this dictum. If everyone produced something useful and was paid for what they did at the same rate as everyone else, the total produced could be purchased by the labor of the producers. Everyone would work and everyone would eat. Everyone would have basically the same lifestyle, as is the case with subsistence culture, but at a much higher level of civilization. What would the state do in perfectly moral community? It is often argued that the state is needed for the provision of public works. But what is a public works but something the government pays for with the taxes it collects from its subjects? The actual work is done by the people. The argument will be made that if the government did not pay for the construction of sewers and roads and so on, no one would have a reason to build them, as people would use them without paying their fair share. But this simply denies what was not asserted. The argument was that if we all paid our own way, we would not need the state. Arguing that some would not pay their own way is a different argument and requires looking into. Once we have established the truth that if we did pay our own way, we would not need the state, we need to look and see if it is possible to create a system in which free riding was not a practical option. However, let's not lose track of the fact that if we had a system in which free riding was no longer possible, there would be no need for the state. So, it is the existence of freeloaders that makes the state necessary, but the state is the mother of all free riders. Without people who do not wish to work, the state would not need to exist, but the state is composed of people who do not wish to work. If there were no free riders, the state could not exist. There is a dynamic between the free riders who compose the state and the free riders whose existence justifies and relies on the state. It is an uneasy dynamic because in one sense the state is ostensibly attempting to solve the problem of the parasite, yet if it solved the problem, it would destroy the reason it exists. The state pretends to work at eliminating free riders, while opening the door to them. The state may say it is creating more jobs, though it is only absorbing free riders into its ranks. The state gives jobs to those it previously provided benefits, though they produce no more wealth than they did before. The state may say it has programs to end homelessness, but gives away free accommodation. The solution is really nothing more than smoke and mirrors, because if the funding ends, they once helped are back on the street. Sometimes the state claims to be getting people off of welfare, but what it does is create high-paying jobs in the public sector. This only makes the problem of free riding worse, as people working in the public sector earn more than those who only collect welfare, without adding to the capital of the community. The question is, how do we ensure people work for what they get and eliminate the possibility of people free riding the system? It is, after all, a far different thing to postulate we ought each to pay our own way, and another to ensure this happens. What we cannot do is rely on the honor system or that people will begin to look at the beam in their own eye rather than the mote in the eyes of others. The moral universal must ensure that the freeloader has no path open to it by which he is able to gain sustenance without working. This means that we need to ultimately eliminate the state as the primary free rider. If we think of the earth as a pool of capital and our life as an asset in which others invest to make it productive, then the Bible's injunction to go forth and replenish the earth makes sense. When we are born, we are a net negative resource. We need to grow up and replenish what we consumed and add to the value of the earth. The earth is akin to the church, but the church proper is the equity added to the earth. However, this value is determined by those for who it was created. The church is not people, but it is the church that defines that value of what we do. The moral universal is reject freedom. Freedom is hell, or hell is freedom. Freedom takes us into the pit of damnation. Yet man lusts after freedom. What is murder, robbery, avarice, sexual lust, and so on but man exercising freedom? The wild man is under no constraints. If there is a right and wrong and a good and evil and lies and truth, there is no freedom. If there is a Holy Spirit that guides into the truth of all things, there is no freedom. Let's be honest, if F2:8-9, for by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast, was as Christians say it is and means what they say it means. How could Matthew 7 verses 21-23? Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils? And in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Be as we say it is? There is no freedom. We either do as we are told, or we have no exhibited faith. God requires faith manifest, not faith paid lip service to. It is not the works that save us. It is the obedience to his word.